Long now. But that was hardly company. Mrs. Stubbs's shop was perched on a little hillock just off the road. It had two big windows for eyes, a broad veranda for a hat, and the sign on the roof scrawled Mrs. Stubbs's was like a little card stuck rakishly in the hat crown. On the veranda there hung a long string of bathing dresses, clinging together as though they'd just been rescued from the sea rather than waiting to go in. And beside them there hung a cluster of sand shoes so extraordinarily mixed that to get at one pair you had to tear apart and forcibly separate at least 50. Even then it was the rarest thing to find the left that belonged to the right. So many people had lost patience and gone off with one shoe that fitted and one that was a little too big. Mrs. Stubbs prided herself on keeping something of everything. The two windows, arranged in the form of a precarious pyramids, were crammed so tight, piled so high, that it seemed only a conjurer could prevent them from toppling over. In the left-hand corner of one window, glued to the pane by 4 gelatine lozenges, there was, and there had been from time immemorial, a notice: "Lost. Handsome gold brooch. Solid gold. On or near beach. Reward offered." Alice pressed open the door, the bell jangled, the red serge curtains parted, and Mrs. Stubbs appeared, with her broad smile and the long bacon knife in her hand. She looked like a friendly brigand. Alice was welcomed so warmly that she found it quite difficult to keep up her manners. They consisted of persistent little coughs and hems, pulls at her gloves, tweaks at her skirt, and a curious difficulty in seeing what was set before her or understanding what was said. Tea was laid on the parlour table, ham, sardines, a whole pound of butter, and such a large Johnny cake that it looked like an advertisement for somebody's baking powder. But the primus stove roared so loudly that it was useless to try to talk above it. Alice sat down on the edge of a basket chair while Mrs. Stubbs pumped the stove still higher. Suddenly Mrs. Stubbs whipped the cushion off a chair and disclosed a large brown paper parcel. "I've just had some new photos taken, my dear," she shouted cheerfully to Alice. "Tell me what you think of them." In a very dainty, refined way, Alice wet her finger and put the tissue back from the first one. Life! How many there were! There were 3 dozen at least, and she held it up to the light. Mrs. Stubbs sat in an armchair, leaning very much to one side. There was a look of mild astonishment on her large face, and well there might be, for though the armchair stood on a carpet, to the left of it, miraculously skirting the carpet border, there was a dashing waterfall. On her right stood a Grecian pillar, with a giant fern tree on either side of it, and in the background towered a gaunt mountain, pale with snow. "It is a nice style, isn't it?" shouted Mrs. Stubbs, and Alice had just screamed sweetly when the roaring of the primus stove died down, fizzled out, ceased, and she said "pretty" in a silence that was frightening. "Draw up your chair, my dear," said Mrs. Stubbs, beginning to pour out. "Yes," she said thoughtfully as she handed the tea, "but I don't care about the size. I'm having an enlargement. All very well for Christmas cards, but I never was the one for small photos myself. You get no comfort out of them. To say the truth, I find them disheartening." Alice quite saw what she meant. "Size," said Mrs. Stubbs. "Give me size. That was what my poor dear husband was always saying. He couldn't stand anything small. Gave him the creeps. And strange as it may seem, my dear, here—" Mrs. Stubbs creaked and seemed to expand herself at the memory. "It was dropsy that carried him off at the last. Many's the time they drawn 1.5 pints from him at the hospital. It seemed like a judgment." Alice burned to know exactly what it was that was drawn from him. She ventured, "I suppose it was water." But Mrs. Stubbs fixed Alice with her eyes and replied meaningly, "It was liquid, my dear." "Liquid?" Alice jumped away from the word like a cat and came back to it, nosing and wary. "That's him," said Mrs. Stubbs, and she pointed dramatically to the life-size head and shoulders of a burly man with a dead white rose in the buttonhole of his coat that made you think of a curl of cold mutton fat. Just below, in silver letters on a red cardboard ground, were the words, "Be not afraid, it is I." "It's ever such a fine face," said Alice faintly. The pale blue bow on the top of Mrs. Stubbs's fair frizzy hair quivered. She arched her plump neck. What a neck she had! It was bright pink where it began, and then it changed to warm apricot, and that faded to the colour of a brown egg, and then to deep creamy. "All the same, my dear," she said surprisingly, "freedom's best." Her soft fat chuckle sounded like a purr. "Freedom's best," said Mrs. Stubbs again. "Freedom!" Alice gave a loud, silly little titter. She felt awkward. Her mind flew back to her own kitchen. Ever so queer. She wanted to be back in it again. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9. A strange company assembled in the Burnells' wash-house after tea. Round the table there sat a bull, a rooster, a donkey that kept forgetting it was a donkey, a sheep, and a bee. The wash-house was the perfect place for such a meeting because they could make as much noise as they liked, and nobody ever interrupted. It was a small tin shed standing apart from the bungalow. Against the wall there was a deep trough, and in the corner a copper with a basket of clothes pegs on top of it. The little window, spun over with cobwebs, had a piece of a candle and a mousetrap on the dusty sill. There were clotheslines criss-crossed overhead and, hanging from a peg on the wall, a huge, rusty horseshoe. The table was in the middle, with a form at either side. "You can't be a bee, Kezia. A bee's not an animal, it's an insect." "Oh, but I do want to be a bee frightfully," wailed Kezia. "A tiny bee, all yellow, furry, with striped legs." She drew her legs up under her and leaned over the table. She felt she was a bee. "An insect must be an animal," she said stoutly. "It makes a noise. It's not like a fish." "I'm a bull, I'm a bull," cried Pip, and he gave such a tremendous bellow. How did he make that noise? That Lottie looked quite alarmed. "I'll be a sheep," said Rags. "A whole lot of sheep went past this morning." "How do you know?" "Dad heard them." "Bah!" He sounded like the little lamb that trots behind and seems to wait to be carried. "Cock-a-doodle-doo!" shrilled Isabel. With her red cheeks and bright eyes, she looked like a rooster. "What'll I be?" Lottie asked everybody, and she sat there smiling, waiting for them to decide for her. It had to be an easy one. "Be a donkey, Lottie." It was Kezia's suggestion. "Hee-haw!" "You can't forget that." "Hee-haw!" said Lottie solemnly. "When do I have to say it?" I'll explain," said the bull. It was he who had the cards. He waved them round his head. "All be quiet, all listen." And he waited for 'em. "Look here, Lottie." He turned up a card. "It's got 2 spots on it, see? Now, if you put that card in the middle and somebody else has one with 2 spots as well, you say, 'Hee-haw,' and the card's yours." "Mine?" Lottie was round-eyed. "To keep?" "No, silly. Just for the game, see? Just while we're playing." The bull was very cross with her. "Oh, Lottie, you are a little silly," said the proud rooster. Lottie looked at both of them. Then she hung her head. Her lip quivered. "I don't want to play," she whispered. The others glanced at one another like conspirators. All of them knew what that meant. She would go away and be discovered somewhere standing with her pinny thrown over her head, in a corner or against a wall, or even behind a chair. "Yes, you do, Lottie. It's quite easy," said Kezia. And Isabel, repentant, said exactly like a grown-up, "Watch me, Lottie, and you'll soon learn." "Cheer up, Lot," said Pip. "There, I know what I'll do. I'll give you the first one. It's mine really, but I'll give it to you. Here you are." And he slammed the card down in front of Lottie. Lottie revived at that, but now she was in another difficulty. "I haven't got a hanky," she said. "I want one badly too." "Here, Lottie, you can use mine." Rags dipped into his sailor blouse and brought up a very wet looking one, knotted together.